Welcome back to That One Future CPA podcast. I'm Christopher Dickerson. This season looks at how numbers tell stories. Cracker Barrel showed us how culture wars impact accounting statements. The hidden ledger of Gen AI showed how technology reshapes our society. Today, we move from tech labs and storefronts to studio lots. A $43 billion corporate marriage promised to redefine storytelling, only to become an accounting lesson in synergy, leverage, and write-offs. Today, this is the story of Warner Brothers Discovery, how love, debt, and goodwill met the limits of arithmetic. In April 2022, cameras followed David Zaslav across the Warner's lot as he declared a new era of storytelling excellence. Behind the optimism sat $55 billion in debt and $43 billion in goodwill. Just 3 years later, the goodwill is shrinking faster than any blockbuster budget. In quarter 2 of 2025, in fact, Warner Brothers Discovery reported $9.8 billion in quarterly revenue, down 3% year over year, and booked nearly $3 billion in gains from debt extinguishment just to keep leverage ratios inside necessary targets. What began as transformation has become triage. This episode isn't about celebrity gossip or streaming wars. It's about how accounting mechanics shape corporate destiny. Every merger begins with optimism recorded as goodwill. Every disappointment shows up later as impairment. When those adjustments reach the size of a small nation's GDP, you stop talking about entertainment and you start talking about economics. All right, let's sort of get into the weeds here, right? When we're talking about Warner Brothers Discovery, we're talking about a massive media conglomerate, right? And we're talking about, HBO, HBO Max, TLC, HGTV, the Food Network, and tons more brands that I'm not even talking about. But I want to take a little bit further step back and really think about how we got here. And it sort of becomes with AT&T. Sort of begins with AT&T, excuse me. And AT&T's exit from media, right, began in 2022, and that sort of set the stage of where we are right now. It spun off Warner Media and it merged it with Discovery through something called a reverse Morris trust. As someone who, I am an accountant, right? I have my undergraduate degree in accounting. I worked for 2 years in tax and I'm getting my graduate degree in accounting right now. I can tell you that there are just so many ways in which corporations and rich individuals move their money around in incredibly complex tax structures that I couldn't even get into, that allows them to do things for non-taxable reasons. In fact, in my tax class right now, with all my peers, we're learning about all of the ways in which corporations can go through reorganization without incurring a tax bill, right? So Discovery shareholders own 29% of the new company. AT&T shareholders had 71% of Warner Brothers Discovery. At launch, the stock opened at $24 per share, market cap at $60 billion. By mid-2025, right, it trades at $9, okay? Management promised $3 billion in annual cost synergies, and I can say from the little bit of experience that I have that management is usually pretty optimistic about the way in which it's forecasting synergies. And so this was always going to be a rosy number, but $3 billion is quite high. And of course, most of this was from staff reductions, overlapping distribution, and technology consolidation. It's funny because one of the themes in the episodes that we speak about is the way in which corporations are able to squeeze margins, and mostly that's through labor and workforce. And you see that this was one of their leading reasons in which they were going to drive synergies, was just simply by chopping heads. Discovery's business model, right? And when we talk about Discovery, again, we're talking TLC, 90 Day Fiance, or sorry, I shouldn't cover my mouth. 90 Day Fiance, or like 90 Days Abroad, or 90 Days the Other Way. I have a theme. Or like HGTV, House Hunters, or Food Network. Food Network is with Warner's. But TLC, you think about those reality TV shows, those streaming shows, Sister Wives, Looking for a Sister Wife, right? Leaving a Sister Wife, all the spinoffs. So their business model, really, Discovery's business model, right, centered around this unscripted content, cheap to produce, fast to monetize, and recognized quickly for revenue. That's the accounting here, right? Warner's relied on high budget, long cycle productions. Warner's is the studio behind, Harry Potter. So when you juxtapose, what you can imagine a Harry Potter movie costs in production costs and travel and promotion and all of these other, costs here, and how long it takes to recognize the revenue from something like that, you can see how these two business models were always going to be in conflict, right? Or at least in juxtaposition of each other. Excuse me. Warner Brothers relied on capitalizing under ASC 926 for film costs and ASC 305 for intangibles. These ASCs are accounting codifications which basically guide corporations and individuals and a lot of people about anything from how to impair goodwill to how to recognize revenue. This merger was really sort of creating financial tension because these business models are simply just not in agreement. Now at closing, Warner Brothers Discovery carried $43.3 billion in goodwill and identifiable intangibles, over half its total assets. Goodwill is basically when a business is worth $50 and I paid $100 for that business. The $50 that's over the identifiable assets, what the business is actually worth, the extra that I paid for that, that's goodwill, right? That's what I think this business is worth because it has great managers, it has a great brand, the logo's really cool, the stores are innovative, it has a proprietary formula, something like that, right? And lots of companies have goodwill on their books because they have, brand equity, right? Coca-Cola and Starbucks have large amounts of goodwill on their books because, the value of them is not just the stores or the coffee or the syrups or the trucks, it's the fact that they're Coca-Cola and Starbucks. So by 2024, impairment had reached $4.2 billion. Another $1 billion in write-offs appeared across content and restructuring changes in Q2 2025. Now, I am a millennial. I am an avid user of Twitter, not TikTok. I don't know. I don't have a high following on TikTok, so I haven't really got into it. But on Twitter, the feed was blowing up when Warner's completed this merger and they started chopping movies, right? I believe Batgirl was a movie that had gotten chopped. Even it was like a Wile E. Coyote movie too. It started cleaning out a bunch of its library. And the cool thing about being an accounting major, an accounting student, and one of the cool things about sharing this podcast with people is I like to say because accounting is the language of business. I'm sitting here, I'm scrolling, I'm watching. From a social media standpoint, people freak out about their favorite TV shows leaving the library. And in my head, I'm realizing this is just impairment. They're just literally trying to get rid of some of these assets so that they can show impairments on the books so they can get to some of the cost savings, some of the very rosy, as I mentioned, very rosy cost savings and synergies that they had been forecasting when they were going through this merger. So gross debt today, not today, right, but by the end of last quarter stands at $35.6 billion with $4.9 billion in cash. Net leverage is 3.3 times adjusted EBITDA. Earnings before interest, depreciation, taxes, and amortization. Interest expense topped $600 million in this quarter. The company has redeemed $7 billion in notes since 2022, right? Adjusted EBITDA for quarter 2025, quarter two of 2025, came in at $1.5 billion, which was down 6% from the prior year. So that's a lot of numbers, and they're big, and a lot of times big numbers can just feel a little fuzzy. So we'll just circle the fact that EBITDA in Q2 2025 was down 6% year over year. I don't think anyone has to understand even what EBITDA is to understand that down 6% year over year is not good. It's not a good direction. And it sort of portends where the company is headed, which is quite frankly divorce. Segment revenue splits tell the story of a media ecosystem that is quite frankly under pressure. Right, the studios, $3.8 billion, which was down 5% year over year, which is quite interesting because they're doing so well with some of the revenue that they had into the summer, right? So we might see a little bit of some of that improve, but they don't have a super strong pipeline. And a lot of their new, like even Harry Potter, they're not making new Harry Potter movies. They're putting that onto Max. So, you know, you have to wonder, like, are they going to recognize the same amount of revenue as they would have putting that energy into a theatrical release? Streaming 2.8 billion, up 4%, and linear networks 4.8 billion, but down 7%. Linear television once funded everything, and now it's dragging everything down. And there is so many think pieces and so many podcasts and so many YouTube videos that can talk about how linear television basically is an unsustainable model. But I can tell you, we could talk about another one. In fact, you know, now that I think about it, the next episode could easily be about what MSNBC, CNBC, NBC News, and Comcast and what's happening there, because they're basically trying to split that stuff off because they understand that linear is dying, and a lot of companies don't have a way of realizing the value there, right? So even here in this short amount of time, we see that consumer attitudes have changed, that linear segment is absolutely dragging down the company. And again, that is leading eventually to our corporate divorce. So I kind of touched on it, but let's lean into it a bit, right? When Discovery merged with Warner's, management problem is discipline and content efficiency. Translated to accounting, that meant shorter amortization schedules, earlier expense recognition, and more impairments on underperforming assets. And any accountant who happens to also love, you know, like Hollywood production news, or if there's any out there, please, drop a comment or a like. But I'm always interested in how things work, and especially how businesses work at all. So again, it was very interesting to watch what they were doing, because in 2023, Warner Bros. Discovery wrote off $3.3 billion in programming. That was finished films like Batgirl and series that they had developed for HBO Max were scrapped to realize tax benefits and remove amortized risk for future periods. Under GAAP, once a project's recoverable value falls below its carrying amount, the loss is immediate. The expense hits now, the saving appears later at higher margins. Okay, so this was all, quite frankly, very smart. It's just smart, right? There's a reason why, you know, CPAs and tax accountants and, you know, valuation peoples and M&A guys and PE firms and IB firms make a lot of, you know, money and fees off these types of deals, is because they know how to squeeze the value out of them, and then they know how to get companies in the right position. Now, I'm not making a comment and saying, like, should they or shouldn't they have gotten rid of Batgirl? I don't know. That's not a culture podcast. But I'm saying from an accounting standpoint, yeah, makes perfect sense, right? The logic shaped the company's 2024 financials. Programming amortization decreased 27% year over year. That reduction accounted for nearly half of the EBITDA improvement executives touted as synergy. One of the cool things about accounting is the legal manipulation of financial statements, because their financial statements are built on a lot of estimates and allowances. And so those allowances within reason can be manipulated, right? So that's legal manipulation. I'm not saying that they're doing something fraudulent, but I'm saying management understands the bounds in which they can operate, and they understand which levers to pull to make certain, because if you understand the way a cash flow statement waterfalls, then you understand, like, this is the lever I can move to make this total number move, right? And so that's exactly what they were doing. That reduction of 27% of programming amortization flows down into your EBITDA improvement. So someone looking at the top line number can look at that EBITDA improvement and say, like, wow, management did it. They did the synergies. They won. They're so smart. And the tax accountants are like, yeah, like, I'm glad I paid attention in corporate tax, because I realized how to really manipulate within the bounds of the accounting realm, within GAAP rules, how to get to that top line number. Now, the balance sheet was telling a little bit of a different story. Capitalized content dropped from 26.6 billion at merger close to 20.2 billion by mid 2025. The company had effectively reduced its creative inventory by a quarter, and we saw this from the bloodletting that was happening on some of these series on HBO Max in particular. Some of the, I mean, I think they got rid of all of Cartoon Network or all of that programming on there. Like, so there was a lot of fervor about what was happening, but it was clearly an accounting play. And quite frankly, I can't blame them because they had to do that. They had to get it done. They had promised these synergies. They had promised, what this future company was going to be able to deliver from top line numbers like EBITDA and earnings per share and net income and things like that. So I'm certain that they were doing what they had to do. It was just, is that the right thing for the consumer? And then if mergers require companies to take such drastic steps to deliver the numbers by which they promise, should those mergers be happening? Right? So what vanquished from our screens reappeared as one-time gains in their statements, and I just laughed as I chuckled as I, scrolled on Twitter as people were being apoplectic about, Batgirl leaving, which is kind of like, I was disappointed because I'm a Batman guy. I love Batman. I love the Christopher Nolan trilogy, and so of course anything Batman related, I'm gonna want to see. And I was personally, a little bit upset about that, but I absolutely saw the finances behind that. And it's quite clear that they knew exactly what they were doing. I guess I sort of want to almost close with talking about corporate culture. And I know as someone who's recruiting and any of my peers who are recruiting or anyone who's like an early professional, that term gets used a lot, like corporate culture. But I think it is important as accountants, as business professionals, finance professionals to understand what that means, because when we're talking about mergers and acquisitions, that matters, right? Management culture, corporate culture really matters. And Discovery's culture was really about cost efficiency. Like we talked about that earlier. When you're cranking out streaming shows, like you don't want them to be expensive. You want them to be like dishy, like you want them to be full of drama, but you don't want them to cost millions of dollars because that completely wrecks the business model. And this is in direct conflict with Warner Brothers, right? They're looking at legacy projects. One of my favorite is The Hobbit. I can firmly remember in 7th grade holding The Hobbit, the orange book, in my hand, reading it in 7th grade humanities. I loved that trilogy, and that's Warner Brothers, right? They did all 3 movies all at one time. Can you imagine how expensive that was? That's cost efficiency, but at a much higher scale. And the merger's financial really show which of these two cultures came out on top. Operating expenses, excluding depreciation, fell 8% year over year. Marketing dropped 1.2%. Headcount is down 20% since 2022. I don't make anything up. I don't pretend to know anything. Yes, I went to a good undergraduate school, UNC Greensboro. I'm at a fabulous is a crazy word. I'm at a great graduate program here at Wake. I don't have to make anything up. Absolutely, if companies want to have cost savings, they're chopping heads, and that's exactly what they did here, right? 20%. The streaming division, right, reports 101 million subscribers, up 2 million year over year, but their average revenue per user fell 3% as these were discounted bundles. And I can tell you, I think you get it for free. I think legacy plans at AT&T are still getting HBO Max for free. I know T-Mobile has it as some type of bundle or something. So while they're growing that revenue base, they're not growing the revenue base per user. And it's funny because I tutor here on campus, and I was just talking to one of my tutors about marginal revenue equaling marginal cost and how that's profit maximization. And I could have easily have used this example. Studio revenue, right, fluctuates with releases, but the consistent trend is deflation of creative investment. Less capitalized content means lower amortization later, which means better margins today. There are absolutely accounting levers that can be manipulated to get the desired top-line outcome, as we spoke in the previous segment. And that's exactly what we're seeing happening here. Last thing I'll say in this piece is that across the industry, across the industry, there's disbelief, right, between the gap between the market and the book value. Because market capitalization at the end of Q2 2025 was 22%, less than half of book equity. Across the industry, right, the disbelief is spreading. Consolidation no longer commands premiums. Investors want simplicity and dividends, not libraries and streaming dreams. What this means is, some people will ask why companies break up, and basically one of the easiest ways to explain that is a very Wall Street term of unlocking shareholder value. What you're saying is that if I have two companies that are together, that the value of the two companies together is less than the value of the two companies separately. So if the value of the company together is $100, but the value of the two companies together is $200, the shareholders have $100 in unrealized value. So the shareholders could split off here. Now they have $100 here and $100 here. They have $200 of value, right? They've unlocked shareholder value by doing the split. And so that's what you have to think about when you think about, well, why people come together and then split off and then come together and then split off, right? They're trying to unlock value. They're trying to realign assets to where they need to be. They're trying to move bad assets to, massage some of those top line numbers. They know exactly what they're doing. And I do believe that because of some of the economic pressures we're seeing in the market, that you'll see a lot of some of these split offs because people do believe that there is some locked up consumer value. In fact, I just read an article yesterday about the Nestle, the new CEO of Nestle, looking to spin off some of its 2,000 brands. And I can guarantee that someone did an analysis and found that there is potential shareholder value that is locked up in that relationship. So again, it is clear why Warner Brothers and Discovery did this merger in the first place. It's even more clear why, again, the divorce is upon us. Now, hey, the podcast is called That One Future CPA. So let's talk about what this means for us who are, future CPAs, current accountants, going into technical accounting advisory, which is what I'll be doing upon graduation. I'm super excited to do it. Like, I really honestly can't wait. And things like Warner Brothers Discovery, they're almost like living syllabuses, right? These are case studies that will be talked about in B schools for years to come. So it's kind of cool to be watching it happen in real time. When I was working this summer, I worked on a team in Big Four that was doing technical accounting in the mergers and acquisition space. And it was really cool getting into some of the weeds. So I'm about to get into the weeds. I apologize. So here we go. Purchase price allocation created the initial goodwill. Now remember, the company is worth $50 and I paid $100 for it. I have $50 of goodwill, right? So purchase price allocation, PPA, created the initial goodwill, and impairment testing reveals when narrative meets math. Deferred tax assets adjust the story every time assets are written down. Impairment means every year I have to look at that $50 and I have to say, is it true that I believe that this segment above its identifiable assets is still worth that 50? Most likely it's not, and then I will test for impairment and see, well, how much do I have to impair that by? And I have to do that every single year. That is required by GAAP rules. Every announcement of quote-unquote synergy is simply just an estimation under ASC 805. Every restructuring is an expense under ASC 420. People who are very, very good, who get paid to do this, right, understand these codifications like 805, which deal with business combinations, I believe. I'm not going to look it up. I'm going to look it up. Let's see. I'm going to look it up real fast, super fast. 805. Oh my gosh, it is business combination. You know what? Don't doubt yourself. Don't doubt yourself. If you're listening to this podcast, do not doubt yourself, because I knew that. Every announcement of synergy is an estimate under ASC 805, right? So when people are looking at the business combinations in ASC 805, based like a guidance on what is supposed to happen, like there are experts who know how to unlock as much shareholder value in these transactions. So when analysts are talking about transformation, accountants translate this into entries. And it's so funny because that's what we were doing in the summer. Like, you're working on a deal that you see in the news, and people are like, savings, synergies, revenue, la 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 la, right? And then you boil it down and you're looking at the statements, and it's like adjusting entries that you sort of learned when you were a sophomore, just at $1 billion scale. And it's kind of funny for something so complicated to actually simply be so simple, like so face value. This is why I love talking about accounting, because people are like, what, like math and crazy. I want to demystify it and say it's actually super cool to see the mechanics of how these things are working. I imagine this is how someone who's a car person, my brother's a car person, I imagine this is how he feels looking at a car engine. I imagine he gets revved up, right? Excited. Like I get excited looking at financial statements and being like, oh, I see what's happening here, right? And that's why I love the language of accounting. And I think more people should open their minds to that as a future career, because, I think it touches a lot of, creativity, exploration, intellectual curiosity, a lot of pieces of people's brains that I don't think that they think about. Okay. The merger demonstrates that accounting doesn't just describe performance, it constrains it. A company that's leveraged like this company was, and again, I did not get into the debt because the debt can be a little wonky, but they were leveraged up to their eyeballs, even if they were standing on top of each other's heads. They were leveraged into the sky, right? So it was clear that, and this is a pretty backwards looking episode, because there's already been news about this divorce pretty much happening, and I could speak more about what that even looks like, but I'm not going to get into that. It's just curious to sort of look at the story, the background, and how it's sort of unfolded. It's kind of interesting. I would say that this is one of the reasons why I love accounting. That I could, I watch HBO Max just like everyone else. I've watched. I grew up watching House Hunters. It's one of the reasons why. I practiced real estate in Texas for a little bit. So these companies have almost shaped my life. I talked about, Harry Potter and The Hobbit, and how I've watched these movies and how these, things have shaped my life. And so it's then interesting to crack open the financial statements and to be able to see what's really going on in there. All right, let's close it up. Warner Brothers Discovery will survive. It has global brands, it has valuable intellectual property, what we call IP, and enough cash to service its debt. But the grand experiment in scale has become an exercise in equilibrium, right? They were trying to be big. Now they really got to find some balance, right? The love of scale brought ambition. Debt enforced discipline, and goodwill measured the distance between the two. Every impairment, every content cut, and every refinancing effort reflects a single idea that in corporate storytelling, the credits never really roll, right? They're just restated. And for accountants, the lesson here, right, for our finance-minded people, the lesson here is that every industry eventually just simply becomes an accounting story. And that's the cool part about it, right? So thank you so much for sticking around for the last 2 episodes. If you haven't listened to the episode before, it's about the hidden ledger of Gen AI. It's very interesting, really sort of digging into some of the environmental and societal externalities that come from these technologies. Next time, we're going to move from Hollywood into sports stadiums. It's one of my favorite subjects. I'm a huge sports fan. Love basketball. I'm a massive Clippers fan. Been a Clippers fan for such a long time. And it's so cool that I get to be here at Wake Forest when Chris Paul was here at Wake Forest, and then he was on the Clippers, and now he's back on the now he's back on the Clippers, and I'm here, and it's like it's so cool. So it's so cool to talk about sports, but we're going to look at the business of amateur athletes, the broadcast contracts, the booster collectives, the private equity that's trying to get in, the NIL money. I have one of my peers here, Denzel, who's a really cool guy, has a company that helps D1 athletes deal with the tax implications of this NIL money. And I'm going to really hope and try that our schedules are working out so I can get him on the pod for our very first guest, so we can really dig into some of the accounting around NIL and the sports stories. If not, I'll talk about that, and then I'm going to have him on at some point. But I definitely want to get his insight because it's very interesting in a space that I haven't thought about. And this company is doing something that companies are not doing right now, speaking directly to these new sort of frontier tax victims, if you will, now having to deal in a space that people did not deal before. So I think it's really cool. So once again, YouTube, Substack, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. I share it on LinkedIn. So like, share, subscribe, so you can stay up for any new episodes. Once again, my name is Christopher Dickerson. This was That One Future CPA podcast, and I hope you have a great day.